Nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to the episode of Cheap Shots, the series dedicated to showing you the way to save monies on the wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, we'll show you how to quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up the Chosen Axes warband for your games of Warhammer Underworlds. We will paint these miniatures to a beautiful tabletop standard, and by using the techniques and the materials that we suggest, we will help you save over $124.13. As you guys can see on this picture, this is what the end result will look like for your miniatures. If you were to get the same materials from Citadel as well as Army Painter, it would cost you a grand total of $149.75, but by using cheap craft paints that we like to use on this channel, you only have to spend $25.62. So that being said, let's go and talk about how to paint up the Chosen Axes more quickly as well as cheaply. Alright, so after you assemble your miniatures, they're pretty easy to get together because they are push fit. Once you guys are done doing that, you want to prime your miniatures as well. In this case, I want to use a flat white primer from Rust-Oleum. I get this stuff from my local Walmart for about $3.99. I just give them the once over real quick over the entirety of the miniature, so that way I have a good surface for my acrylic paints to adhere to. Priming actually does a couple of things that's quite important. The first thing it actually does, it helps your acrylic paint to adhere to the surface of the miniature. If you were to take acrylic and put it on bare plastic, unfortunately it would just rub off with the slightest bit of friction, so it ruined the overall effect on your miniature. So that's why you want to use primer to kind of help make sure that that acrylic paint stays. The second thing that primer does also is that depending on what color you use for your primer also has a impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you use. Now, because we're doing an oil wash, it's going to really darken down the value of the colors that we're using on these miniatures. I'm using a flat white primer, so that way it can accentuate the color brightness of the colors, so that way they don't get muted out when we do the oil washing. Now, the first thing we do, of course, is to paint the flesh. Now, there's a lot of flesh on these guys because they are fire slayers from Age of Sigmar, so I want to have like this, they have this kind of like ruddy, kind of darkened colored look to their flesh tones. So to create that same effect, we're going to actually put 2 thin coats of chestnut by Apple Barrel paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I just put 2 thin layers all over the flesh that's exposed on these guys, and once I get done with that, I got a good solid base coat to build up the brightness of their flesh tones. So as you can see here, they have like their arms, their backs, their legs. A lot of their flesh is exposed. Very little bit on their face, which is kind of nice because I'm not really good at detail painting for faces. So just do the quick 2 coats real quick and you're ready to move on. So now that we're done with the base coat, the next thing we're going to do, of course, is a dry brush. So we're going to dry brush the miniature's flesh with Flesh Tone by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. I just do a quick dry brush real quick all over the entirety of the miniature for the flesh that we did earlier. By doing this, what we do is we create the illusion of depth on our miniatures. What ends up happening is that when you dry brush, the darker color stays in the recesses of the miniature, while the highlights of the miniatures, the raised surfaces, get dusted with the pigment from the flesh color, creating that illusion of depth. So you have highlights as well as shadows. So we do that real quick over the entirety of the flesh on these miniatures as well to kind of create that kind of ruddy, kind of flush look that these guys would have because they're on fire all the time. So now they're done with the flesh, the next thing I do, of course, is work on the clothing. Now, there's not very many clothing on these guys. Fire Slayers like to basically fight in the buff. So basically, the only thing we're doing is things like their loincloths that they're wearing on their bodies, all right? And for that, we're going to use Mermaid Blue by Delta Serum Coat. You can get this to your local Walmart for about 65 cents. And the reason why we're using this color is because there's a lot of flesh as well as a lot of orange in these miniatures, as well as a lot of gold. So having a contrasting color like this bright Mermaid Blue is going to be very eye-catching. It's also going to bring a lot of that detail out. So we can put 2 thin layers of Mermaid Blue on all the loincloths on the fighters. They're not very much of it on these fighters. They're barely clothed. So once you guys are done with that, you can move on to the next major detail. And that next major detail is their hair, basically. So these guys are dwarves, so they have big, huge beards that cover majority of the surface of their bodies, and they have these awesome mohawks on the top of their head, kind of like the old Slayer miniatures from Warhammer, the Old World, and Warhammer Fantasy Battle. So to pick out those details, we're going to put 2 thin layers of Ripe Tomato by Apple Barrel paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. It's a nice, vibrant orange color, and as you can see, it brings out a lot of that detail. It kind of pops nicely against that Mermaid Blue that we used earlier for their clothing, and it also contrasts quite nicely with the darker flesh tone they put on these guys. We just put 2 thin coats of Ripe Tomato on the mohawks as well as the beards, and the next thing we gotta do, of course, is to highlight that detail. And the color we're going to use to do that is Tropic Orange by Apple Barrel. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. It's a nice pastel orange color. We're just going to do a quick dry brushing along the mohawks as well as the beards that these fighters have. As you can see, it does a really good job of highlighting those details by bringing out those textures we couldn't see before while leaving that darker orange color in the recesses of the miniature as well. And once we get done with the dry brushing, the next thing we work on now, oddly enough, are the bases. One of the really cool things about Warhammer Underworld miniatures is that they have these really beautiful textured bases, but they have like designs and stuff on it. So we're going to start focusing on that major detail next. So the first color we're going to use is Payment by Apple Barrel Paint. It is a very, very, very dark gray, almost to the color of black. But the reason why I like using this paint, aside from the price point of 50 cents, is that it has a little bit of a grit texture to it, which makes it really great for using dry brushing on. So we're going to cover basically the entirety of the bases for the most part in this pavement color. We're just going to do quick two thin layers real fast, and then we're ready to move on to do highlights with the dry brushing. The first dry brush we're going to use is Elephant Gray by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents as well. We're just going to do a quick dry brushing all over the entirety of the bases that we painted in pavement. And the reason why we're doing this is once again to create that illusion of depth and also bring out a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier, things like the cracks in the ground that they're walking on, individual stones, bone pieces of fragments of bone and of beasts that they've killed in the past, all kinds of different effects. And we're going to do another dry brushing real quick using Granite Gray by Apple Barrel Paint. That also costs 50 cents as well. And we're going to do a quick dry brush all over the entirety of the base once again. And that's going to give a further layer of highlighting and bring a lot of those details that we couldn't see earlier. And the reason why I like to use two shades of gray in order to dry brush the bases like this is because when you apply the oil wash on it, it will mute down that pastel kind of look to it and smooth out those transitions, but at the same time maintain those highlights that we have brought out earlier on the bases. So the next detail we'll work on real quick are on the bone elements. So a lot of these guys have things like skulls and femurs and bits of ribs all over the bases of their what they're standing on. I think this represents the creatures that they managed to slay in the course of their time as warriors. So to bring out those details, we're going to pick those out of two thin layers of light mocha by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a beautiful dark beige color that I like to use for a lot of bone details on our miniatures. You just put two thin layers on the bone that is exposed on the bases, and then we move on to our dry brush. And the last bit of dry brush we're going to do for the bone elements is using Ivory by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice antique white color that I use real quick to do a quick dry brushing on the bone elements on the bases to get some more detail. And once we're done with that, we can start working on the metallic elements. So I do apologize for this one. I forgot to take a photo of one of the steps that I took, so I will explain what that is here in a second. So the very first detail we're going to use is actually use Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art. It's a beautiful gunmetal color that we're going to use to paint all the blades of the weaponry as well as bits of the armor. So things like the helmets, for example, the blades of the axes, any chainmail that's on these guys, bracelets and ringlets, whatever the case you want to be like a metallic gunmetal color, you can put two thin layers on that to bring out those details. And then once we're done with that, we're also going to add some copper details as well by using Folk Art Copper, and that also costs 75 cents. We're using things like, for example, the butt plates of the axes, the handles of the weapons, for example, some of the iconography that's located in the helmets as well as some of the other pieces of jewelry these characters are wearing. And the very last metallic element we're going to use, of course, is gold. We're going to use gold by Folk Art. This costs about 75 cents at your local Walmart. And we're going to use this, of course, to pick all the gold elements on these characters. So things like the runes on the blades of the axes, the crests of their helmets. Their helmets have these beautiful dragon heads on the top of their helmets. We're going to pick those out in two thin layers of gold as well. Same thing with some of the jewelry these guys are wearing as well. If you look closely at these guys, they actually have little metallic runes like embedded in their flesh. So we're going to pick out those details in that gold color as well as some of the gold ingots that are scattered along their bases as well. And the very last detail we're going to pick out are some of the gemstones that these guys are wearing as well. We're going to kick that on two thin layers of New Shamrock by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice bright green color that contrasts nicely with all the gold elements. So they have, if you notice, these guys on their ringlets and their armlets, they have like little bangles that they're wearing with little gemstones on it. We're going to pick those out in two thin layers of New Shamrock so that we can bring that detail out. Things like the helmets, for example, the dragon heads on the crests of their helmets also have eyes. We're going to pick that on two thin layers of New Shamrock as well. And once we're done picking out all those gemstones, the next thing we got to do, of course, is an oil wash. So for this step, we're going to use an oil wash to use it all over the entirety of the miniatures. Now, a lot of people like to use Army Painter Strong Tone in order to do this, which is perfectly fine. It's a wonderful product and is exactly as advertised. The only problem is that it's quite pricey. It's around $35 a can. Whereas Minwax Polyshaded Mission Oak, Acrylic Polyacrylic and Mission Oak does exactly the same thing and costs a fraction of the price at $6.99 at my local Walmart. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that polyshaded acrylic and use it like a wash all over the entirety of the miniatures. Now, the oil washing does a couple of things. The first thing it does, it brings a lot of the details that we couldn't see earlier in the miniatures. So things like the individual recesses and the beards, like the individual fibers of hair, as well as their beards, things like the textures on the bases, the musculature that they have, gaps in armor panels, scroll work on the weaponry that they're carrying. It brings out all those details because that dark stain goes directly into those recesses and brings those details out. The second thing it also does as well is it smooths out the transitions between our dry brushing as well as our base coating. If you'll notice, that chalky pastel appearance is now gone, and that's because the oil wash helps to blend those colors together and to smooth out those transitions and make it look a little bit more organic looking. And the last thing it also does too is it also meets the vibrancy of the colors that we use on these miniatures. As you can see, that very bright cartoony colors we were using earlier has been severely muted down to the medium tone, and it looks really awesome as well. Now, there is polyurethane in this product, so because of that, you will need to let these miniatures sit and dry for about 24 hours for the polyurethane in order to set. If you handle these miniatures beforehand, if it's quite tacky, you can actually ruin the finish on your miniatures. So just use it as the very last step of your painting process for whenever you paint, and let them dry and cure. And once they're done, of course, they're going to have a really hard shell protective layer on your miniatures, and you're going to have a high gloss finish when you get done. Alright, so the next step, of course, is now to finish the very last detail on these miniatures, which is the bases, on the rim of the bases. So in this case, I use Skyline by Folk Art. It's a nice bluish gray color I like to use for all the skirmish games that we use in our Studios collection. So I use this for things like Mordheim as well as Necromunda. So I plan on using these Fire Slayers as Necromunda, I plan on using these guys as Mordheim miniatures. So because I just picked those bases out, 2 thin layers of that Skyline color, and of course let it dry. And once we're done, we have one last step to do, which is completely optional. So like I mentioned before, you will have a high gloss finish on these miniatures when you get done using the oil wash because of the polyurethane. I like a matte finish on my miniatures, so this step is completely optional. If you do like that high gloss finish, then by all means skip this step. But if you want a matte finish on your miniatures, buy a can of Krylon matte varnish spray. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $5.99. I just spray this all over the entirety of the miniatures to mute out that sheen. By doing that and bringing down the luminosity of the gloss, you can see a lot of the details you couldn't see earlier from the reflective surfaces of the miniature. And it looks really awesome, and it's ready to go. And once again, this is the end result that we showed you guys earlier. As you can see, our Fire Slayers are painted up to a beautiful tabletop standard, and they're ready to throw down on the tabletop as well. And you can do this, of course, for your games of Warhammer Underworld, or for me, I'm going to use these guys as Troll Slayers for an upcoming Mordheim campaign. So now that we're done talking about exactly how we paint up these miniatures, let's talk about the materials you need to buy from Army Painter as well as Citadel in order to achieve the exact same results we did, but using their products instead. Alright, so this is the shopping list you'll need to buy from Citadel as well as Army Painter to paint up your miniatures the same way we did, but using their name brand products instead. You'll need to buy Corax White Spray for $17, as well as Baneblade Brown, Longbeard Gray, Caliban Green, Luganeth Orange, Bugman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone, Ulthuan Gray, Slanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, Troll Slayer Orange, and Rust Gray. And each of those colors cost $4.55 per pot. You also need to buy a pot of Talazar Blue, Lead Belcher, Retributor Armor, as well as Screaming Bell, and those colors run $7.80 for those. You'll need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32 in total, as well as a can of Minotaurian Varnish for $19.50 if you want to have a matte finish on your miniatures. Now, assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $149.75 in order to paint up your miniatures the same way we did, but using the name brand paints instead. Now, our cheapskate total came up to a grand total of $25.62, and when you subtract the difference, you end up saving $124.13. So there you guys have it. This is how you guys can quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up your warband of chosen axes for your games of Warhammer Underworlds. And if you're looking for a way to save money, may I suggest using cheap craft paints in order to do so. They get similar results at a fraction of the price, and in these inflationary times, saving money is more important now than ever before, especially when it comes to your wargaming hobby. So that's good to do for you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. You guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this one, you guys. I'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.